The wind came without warning, a blade drawn across the dark, slicing through the silence that had settled over the ruins like a burial shroud. Snow fell in slow, deliberate curtains across the broken walls and shattered archways of what had once been a fortified outpost, abandoned so many decades ago that even the maps disagreed on its name. Ice had turned the desert into something alien, something wrong. The men of Delta 7 had trained in heat, in sand, in the blinding white of noon. Not this. Never this. When the first radio went silent, no one panicked. Equipment failed in the cold. Everyone knew that. When the second went silent, the team leader checked the hardware. When the third went silent, and then the fourth, and the drone that Corporal Decker launched climbed 40 meters into the gray pre-dawn sky and simply vanished from the control screen like a candle snuffed by an unseen hand. That was when the silence stopped being a technical problem and started being something else entirely. Something deliberate, something patient, something that had been waiting in the white long before they arrived. The desert had no business being cold. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had served 2 tours in the Kandahar Valley, 1 rotation in the Syrian lowlands, and a brief, miserable stint along the Ethiopian plateau. He understood desert in the way a man understood an old adversary, its rhythms, its cruelties, its particular brand of indifference. Heat shimmer, dust in the teeth. The way shade felt like mercy. This was not that desert. The Tarhun Basin in late January sat at roughly 1,400 meters elevation, and when the Arctic Oscillation had pushed a cold front south through the continent that week, it had done so without ceremony or warning. The temperature had dropped to -11 Celsius overnight. The sand had crusted into a pale, brittle surface that crackled underfoot like broken glass, and above that surface lay 4 inches of powder snow, unusual enough that the meteorology team had flagged it twice before the mission briefed. The ruins they had been tasked to sweep were pre-colonial fortifications, a labyrinthine complex of sandstone walls and collapsed towers spread across roughly 3 square kilometers of elevated ground. Reconnaissance had placed a low-level insurgent logistics node somewhere within the structure, not a fighting force, Command had said, more of a way station. A few guards, a cache, maybe a comms relay, a cleanup job. 2 hours in, 2 hours out, done before the sun was fully up. That had been the plan. Webb's Unit 12 operators from 3rd Special Forces Group, call sign Delta 7, had inserted via ground vehicle 2 clicks east and moved in on foot before 0300. The ruins rose before them in the dark, like the skeleton of something enormous. Walls broken at irregular heights, archways gaping, shadows pooling in corners that hadn't seen light since the last occupants left. The cold made the air taste like iron. Private First Class Claire Hartwell moved in the middle of the column, between Specialist Torres and the unit's intelligence liaison, a quiet, precise man named Sergeant First Class Douglas Farr. Hartwell had been attached to Delta 7 6 weeks prior. As a replacement signals specialist, her predecessor had taken a vehicle casualty in training, nothing combat-related, just bad luck and a bad road. She was 24, recently promoted, and had spent most of her first 3 weeks with the unit enduring the particular social weather system that greeted all new arrivals. The studied indifference, the small exclusions, the way the more established operators spoke around her rather than to her. She didn't complain. She watched. Webb noticed her the way you noticed furniture registered her presence, filed it, moved on. Farr had given her a competent evaluation in her 2nd week and said nothing further. To most of the unit, Hartwell was simply a warm body attached to the signals package, someone to manage the secondary communications array while the real operators did real things. What no one noticed, because no one was looking, was the way she moved through the ruins. Most of the unit picked paths by the most direct route around obstacles, over debris, through gaps. Hartwell moved differently. She mapped. Every time the column slowed, she turned her head in small, methodical increments, reading the geometry of the walls, the sight lines, the wind angles. She noted where the snow had drifted against eastern faces, not western, which told her something about the predominant wind direction. She noted the angle of the slope that rose to the northeast and the collapsed tower at its apex, which offered elevation and concealment in approximately equal measure. She said nothing. At 0347, the radio on Webb's vest went quiet. Not static, not degraded signal. Quiet, as though someone had reached through the air and turned a dial from sound to nothing. Webb tapped the unit, checked the frequency, tried the backup channel. Silence. Torres, he said quietly. Secondary. Torres pulled out his handset, keyed it twice. Nothing. He looked at Webb with an expression that tried to be professional and landed somewhere between confused and unsettled. Hartwell, Webb said, not turning. Status on the comms package. Hartwell had already pulled her diagnostic tablet. No hardware failure, she said. Signals being blocked, not jammed, there's no interference signature. It's more like the transmission is being absorbed. Absorbed. Or interrupted very precisely. I'm not sure yet. Webb stared at her for a moment, then turned to the darkness ahead. Keep scanning, he said. Everyone stays tight. We move. 300 meters to the northwest, a scout team Sergeant Patrick Gould and Corporal Reyes had stopped moving 4 minutes earlier. No one in the main column knew this yet, because the radio that would have carried that information was no longer working. The ruins absorbed the darkness. The cold ate the sound. And in the elevated wreckage of the northeast tower, something patient was watching, and calculating, and waiting. Gould found the drone at 0402. It had come down in the interior courtyard of the ruins' eastern section, not crashed, exactly, but descended in a controlled spiral, as though the guidance system had been gently switched off mid-flight. The rotors were still intact. The camera housing was cracked along one edge. When Reyes picked it up and turned it over, they both saw the same thing. A small, precisely punched hole through the signal antenna housing. The hole was round and clean and no larger than a pencil. Gould looked up at the walls surrounding the courtyard, then at the hole, then at Reyes. We need to call this in, Reyes said. With what? Gould replied. Neither of them had working radios. Back in the main body of Delta 7, the silence was becoming architectural. It was building itself into something with weight and presence. By 0415, Webb had confirmed that 7 of the unit's 11 radios were non-functional, not damaged, not battery depleted. Simply terminated. The remaining 4 were degrading in real time, their signal strength dropping in increments so regular and deliberate they looked like a countdown. Specialist Decker, who had launched the lost drone, was the first to name what his eyes were telling him. Sergeant, he said, pulling Webb aside while the column held at a rubble choke point. These aren't failing, they're being shot. Webb turned slowly. Say again. Decker held up the handset from Torres's kit, which had gone silent 20 minutes earlier. He pointed to the antenna port. There was a gouge along one edge, not a contact scar, not wear damage. Something had struck it at a precise angle with a precise object and neutralized the component. Someone is shooting out our radios, Decker said. Not us, not the hardware. Someone out there is putting rounds into our antenna units. Range has to be, he looked up, mapped the geometry without meaning to. 150 meters minimum, probably further. In the dark, in the cold. Webb said nothing for a long moment. In the middle of the column, Hartwell had stopped pretending to run diagnostics. She was looking at the northeast tower. By 0430, Delta 7 had fragmented. The unit's standard doctrine called for 3-element sweeps in environments with uncertain contact. Webb had deployed accordingly. Gould and Reyes to the east, Decker's 4-man team to the south corridor, and his own 5 holding the center. The plan had assumed working radios, functioning coordination, the ordinary machinery of military communication. That machinery was now scrap. Each element moved through the ruins isolated, the silence wrapping them like gauze, the cold pressed down, the snow-absorbed footsteps. The wind moved through broken archways and produced sounds that the human ear reflexively tried to categorize as voices, as footsteps, as breathing. Decker's team lost their last working radio at 0441. They didn't know it until Specialist Aguilar tried to call in a grid reference and got nothing but dead air. Aguilar held the handset out and looked at it as though it had personally offended him. It was working 10 minutes ago, he said. It's not working now, Decker replied, and kept moving. Gould had found a position on the rubble rise near the eastern wall, and was scanning with his rifle's thermal optic. The ruins were cold enough that the ambient temperature differential was minimal, which degraded thermal significantly shapes appeared, but refused to resolve into certainty. He swept slowly, methodically. He stopped on a shape in the far northeast. Elevated. Roughly human-sized. Stationary. He fired twice. The shots echoed through the ruins in a way that the cold amplified and distributed, making it impossible to determine direction. The shape in the thermal did not move. When the echo died, the silence that replaced it felt deeper than before, as though the shots had displaced something and the emptiness had rushed in to fill the space. Gould lowered the rifle. Did you hit? Reyes asked. I don't know, Gould said. I'm not sure it was a person. In the center of the complex, Webb heard the shots and stopped. He turned to Hartwell, who was behind him and slightly left. She had been subtly repositioning herself throughout the movement, always finding the edge of the column, always angling toward the interior walls. "Those were ours," he said. "Yes," she said. "You know where the shot position is." It wasn't a question. He had been watching her for the last 30 minutes, in the way a good commander eventually starts watching the people his instincts flag, even when he can't explain why. Hartwell met his eyes. "I have a theory," she said. "Tell me." She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Not yet," she said. Webb stared at her. "That's not." "I know," she said. "Not yet." She turned back to the darkness and said nothing further. The pattern was becoming visible to anyone who wanted to see it. The radios had been eliminated in clusters, not randomly, but by grouping, by unit cohesion. Whichever element had the most concentrated communications capability had been prioritized first. The effect was not just silence but controlled silence. The command structure of Delta 7 was being methodically decapitated from a distance, in the dark, without a single casualty. Without a single sound that could be positively attributed to an incoming round. Just absence. Just quiet. Just the slow, deliberate erasure of their ability to speak to each other or to anyone outside. Someone out there was not trying to kill them. Someone out there was trying to blind them. The story started with Aguilar. It always started with the youngest operator, the one with the most imagination and the least experience to suppress it. Aguilar had been in service for 3 years, had done one overseas rotation that had been largely administrative, and had the particular combination of intelligence and inexperience that produced elaborate narrative frameworks in the absence of data. "Ghost sniper," he said, not to anyone in particular. Around 0450, when Decker's element had taken shelter in a partially intact interior room to recalibrate. "Shut up, Aguilar," said Specialist Fletcher. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "No one is thinking that." "A sniper who doesn't kill people," Aguilar continued, ignoring Fletcher with the serenity of the truly convinced. "Just disappears them from the system. Takes out the hardware, not the operator. That's not just skill. That's a philosophy." Decker, to his credit, was listening while pretending not to. The kid was wrong about everything except the core of it. The shots were precisely placed. The targeting was deliberate and informed by an understanding of military communications architecture that went beyond casual familiarity. Whoever was out there knew how Delta 7 was organized, knew the priority of each radio unit, knew the logical sequence in which to degrade the network to produce maximum disorientation with minimum direct engagement. That was not an insurgent logistics guard. Fletcher had seen something an hour earlier that he hadn't reported because it made no sense. A shape, briefly, on the eastern wall, hunched low, moving in the particular way that people moved when they didn't want to be seen. Not the heavy movement of a soldier under load. Something lighter, faster. Something that used the ruins the way water used low ground, flowing into angles and shadows without resistance. He had blinked, and it had been gone. He hadn't mentioned it because the shape had been small. Too small for a soldier, too efficient for a civilian. The cognitive dissonance had simply registered as a visual error and been filed away. At 0507, Webb's last working radio died. He stared at the handset for a long, controlled moment, then set it down on a broken wall with deliberate care, as though setting it down gently might eventually convince it to work again. Delta 7 was now entirely isolated. 12 operators in 3 separated elements. No communications, no drone coverage, no contact with the extraction team waiting 2 clicks east. Dawn was approximately 90 minutes away. Webb turned to his remaining element himself, Farr, Hartwell, and 2 operators named Calloway and Briggs, and made a decision. "Hartwell," he said. "Talk." She talked. Her voice was flat and precise. She chose her words the way the sniper had apparently chosen targets, with economy and accuracy, and without a wasted syllable. "The radios were taken in a specific sequence," she said. "Command and control units first, long-range transmitters second, short-range coordination units third. This is not a random disruption pattern. This is a deliberate tactical degradation following standard SF communication doctrine. Whoever is doing this knows our organizational structure." Farr, who had been quiet through most of the night, leaned forward slightly. "That's a serious statement." "I know. It implies pre-operational intelligence on our unit. Or it implies someone who can read the patterns in real time and extrapolate structure from behavior." Farr studied her. "Which is harder, but not impossible." Hartwell nodded. "The shots are coming from elevated positions that change. Northeast tower initially, then the southern wall ridgeline, then somewhere in the interior high ground. The pattern of movement between positions follows the wind. The shooter is using wind noise to mask repositioning. In this temperature, with the snow on rubble, that's possible but requires intimate familiarity with the specific terrain, not scouted familiarity. Lived familiarity. Webb watched her deliver this. The analysis was clean. The confidence was not the performed confidence of someone who had rehearsed it, was the flat, undemonstrative certainty of someone who had simply looked at the same information and reached conclusions earlier than everyone else. "You've been tracking the shot positions," he said. "Since the second radio. Why didn't you say something?" She hesitated. For the first time in the conversation, something moved behind her eyes, not emotion, exactly, but the shadow of it. "I wasn't sure enough," she said, "and I needed to understand the intent before I started explaining the method." "And the intent?" Farr asked. "Not hostile," Hartwell said. "The intent is protective. Every radio that's been taken out was a transmission source that a third party could use for targeting. Someone is clearing the electronic signature of this unit, reducing our detectable profile. They're not trying to isolate us from command." She paused. "They're trying to make us invisible to something else." The cold room was very quiet. "What's something else?" Calloway asked. Hartwell looked at the door of the room. Beyond it, the ruins extended into the pre-dawn dark. "I think we're about to find out," she said. Calloway had served with Webb for 4 years and considered himself a good reader of people. He had, in that time, developed a taxonomy of field liars, the ones who lied about courage, about capability, about what they'd seen and not seen. He could spot them by the particular brightness that came into their eyes when the story and the truth diverged. Hartwell's eyes were not bright. They were the opposite of bright, dark and flat and contained, like a lake in winter surface still, depth unknown. "You know the shooter," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a conclusion stated plainly. Hartwell didn't answer immediately. "That's a no denial," Webb observed. "I know the profile," she said finally. "I've encountered this methodology before, in training, in case studies." She paused. "I know what this looks like." "That's not what he asked," Webb said. Another pause. Longer. Farr watched her with the patience of a man who had spent years extracting information from people who didn't want to give it. "The relevant question," he said quietly, "is not whether you personally know the individual. The relevant question is whether you understand their objective well enough to help us survive it." Hartwell looked at him. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly. In her posture, a fraction of tension released. "I think so," she said, "but we need to move. The last 2 radios that are still partially functional," she gestured at the units Calloway and Briggs were carrying, "are still broadcasting on residual carrier wave. Someone can use that to triangulate our position. Then we turn them off," Calloway said, reaching for his unit. "No," Hartwell said sharply. "Then, more controlled. Not yet. We need to consolidate the elements first. If we go dark before Decker and Gould know to go dark, they'll keep broadcasting, and we'll lose track of each other." Webb made the decision in the time it took to exhale. "Calloway, Briggs, go find Decker. Building-to-building movement, no lights, no radio. Bring them back here." He turned to Hartwell. "You're with me and Farr. We go find Gould." "And then?" Farr asked. Webb looked at Hartwell. "Then you turn off the last radios," she said, "and we stop being a target." High above them, in a position that offered a clear line of sight to every major route through the ruins, a figure lay motionless in the snow, rifle braced across a crumbled parapet. The cold was irrelevant. The discomfort was irrelevant. The time was not dawn was coming, and with it, something that had been watching the ruins from a different direction, with different equipment, for different reasons. The figure tracked the movement below with the unhurried precision of someone who had made every calculation twice and found the answers consistent. 3 radios left active in the unit. One shooter who knew exactly where they were, had known since before they arrived, and had chosen over and over, through the long, cold hours, not to use that knowledge to harm them. The decision to protect was not made once. It was made continuously. Every minute it held, it cost something. The figure in the snow did not move, and the calculation continued. The consolidation took 41 minutes. Calloway found Decker's element in the southern corridor. Took 30 seconds to convince Decker that radio silence was not a command failure but a survival necessity, and led them back to the interior room through a route that added 6 minutes but avoided 2 open ground crossings, where the sky had begun to lighten marginally at the horizon's edge. Webb found Gould and Reyes at the eastern wall rubble rise. Gould was still scanning with his thermal systematically. stubbornly, refusing to accept that he couldn't see what was seeing him. Farr pulled him down from the position with a single, quiet word. "Roof," Farr said. Gould blinked. "What?" "You're silhouetted from the north. You've been silhouetted for 20 minutes. If the shooter wanted you down, you'd be down." Farr looked at him steadily. "You're being left up. Think about why." Gould came off the rise without further protest. When the full unit was consolidated, 11 operators, 1 intelligence specialist, 1 signals specialist, 1 very small room with 3 walls and no ceiling. Webb stood in the middle and looked at Hartwell. "Now," he said, "all of it." She looked at the assembled faces, some skeptical, some frightened in the particular way that trained soldiers were frightened, suppressed, controlled, but present. Aguilar watching her with the intensity of someone waiting to hear a story confirmed. Decker with his arms crossed, professional distance maintained. Far behind and to the right, watching with neutrally analytical attention. "There is one shooter," she said. "They've been operating in this complex since before we arrived. They've eliminated 11 radio units without injuring a single operator. The precision required for that is," she paused, "not for effect, but for accuracy, extraordinary. We're talking about sub-centimeter accuracy on moving targets in near darkness, at ranges between 80 and 200 meters, using a platform that produces minimal sound signature in sub-zero temperatures." She paused again. "This is not a trained military shooter. This is something beyond that. This is someone who learned this specific terrain and this specific skill set together as a single integrated system." "The ghost sniper," Aguilar said softly. "No one told him to shut up this time. The reason I've held back," Hartwell continued, "is that I've been verifying the pattern before naming it, because the second part is harder to accept." She looked directly at Webb. "The shooter has been protecting us. Every radio they've taken out was a transmission source that a third-party signals intelligence team has been using to paint our position. There is a secondary force, not the logistics node we were briefed on, but something larger and more dangerous operating in this basin. They've been tracking us by our radio emissions since we inserted." Decker uncrossed his arms. "Secondary force. How do you know?" "Because the shooter's pattern isn't random degradation. It's targeted suppression of our highest gain transmission sources in sequence. That's not a sniper acting on tactical impulse. That's a sniper who has visibility of a threat we don't know about and is taking preemptive action on our behalf." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence outside. This one had weight and texture. "So, the person who has been shooting our equipment," Webb said slowly, "is on our side." "I think so. And there's something worse out there." "I think so," she said again. Fletcher said what everyone was calculating. "Then why haven't they made contact? Why the silent treatment? Why not just," he gestured, "come out and say something?" Hartwell looked at the broken ceiling of the room. Through the gap, the sky above the ruins was beginning to shift the absolute black of 0300, softening toward the deep blue-gray of pre-dawn. "Because," she said quietly, "some people have learned to solve problems alone. It's the only way they know." She said it without inflection. Farr, who had been watching her face throughout, noted the micro-expression that crossed it and filed the observation away. "Turn off the radios," she said. "All of them. Right now." They did, and in the sudden, total silence, they all heard it faint, at the edge of audibility, from the direction of the western approach to the ruins. The sound of vehicles. Multiple vehicles, moving without lights through the frozen dark, guided by something that did not require them to see, only to receive. A signal. A signal they had been broadcasting without knowing it. The signal that was no longer there. The vehicles stopped. In the ruins' western approach, 3 technical vehicles, modified pickup trucks with heavy weapons mounted in the beds, sat idling in the dark, their drivers scanning frequencies on military-grade signals intercept equipment. For the last 40 minutes, they had been following the emission trail of Delta 7's radios with the patience of hunters who knew their prey couldn't run far. The prey had good military hardware and good military training, which was irrelevant when the prey was broadcasting its location every 30 seconds. Now, nothing. The signals team in the lead vehicle ran diagnostics. All clear on their end. The emission sources had simply stopped all of them, nearly simultaneously, as though someone had thrown a circuit breaker on the entire unit. The team leader made a call. They would wait. Soldiers didn't go dark forever. Someone would key a radio to check in, to report, to do the ordinary administrative business of staying alive in a hostile environment. Someone always did. They would wait 30 minutes, then advance into the ruins and sweep conventionally. They had 22 men. Delta 7, if their intelligence was accurate, had 12. They waited. In the interior room of the ruins, Webb was running the math. 20-plus combatants, vehicle-mounted weapons, signals intercept capability. We have 11 operators and 1 analyst and no communications. He looked around the room. We cannot call for extraction. We cannot coordinate with any supporting element. We are, in the most complete possible sense, alone. Not entirely alone, Farr said, and looked at Hartwell. Hartwell was looking at the ceiling again, or rather, at the sky beyond the ceiling. The light was shifting perceptibly now. Dawn was perhaps 40 minutes out. The shooter, she said, is still out there, and they're going to have the same problem we have when the Western force advances. They can slow them down. They can disrupt them. But one shooter against 22, in an open advance, in increasing light, she stopped. They can't do it alone, Webb finished. No, she said. They need us to know where to be. Webb looked at her for a long moment. She was 24 years old and had been attached to his unit for 6 weeks and had spent most of that time being furniture. He thought about the way she had moved through the ruins, the way she had watched the walls, the way she had known before any of them what the pattern meant. Hartwell, he said, where do we need to be? She pulled out a paper map, not a digital device. A paper map, already annotated with pencil marks in a precise, economical hand, and spread it across the rubble floor. Here, she said, pointing, and here, and here. The pencil marks were already on the map. She had made them hours ago, in the dark, while moving with the column, while everyone was looking past her. Decker stared at the marks. You planned this position before we even knew. I didn't plan it, she said quietly. I inherited it. Nobody asked what that meant. Not yet. They moved. The Western force entered the ruins at 0552. They came in 2 elements, one through the primary western gate, one through a breach in the northern wall that their advanced scouts had identified 2 days prior. They moved with the efficiency of a well-funded, well-equipped paramilitary unit that had conducted this type of operation before. Systematic, professional, confident. The confidence lasted approximately 4 minutes. The first shot came from the northeast tower, a position that the Western forces' intelligence had assessed as unsound, structurally compromised, too exposed. The round struck the signals intercept unit mounted on the lead vehicle's dashboard with a precision that removed the equipment from the vehicle without injuring the operator, who sat for 2 full seconds staring at the smoking hole where his screen had been before the adrenaline caught up with his comprehension. The second shot, 6 seconds later, took the antenna array off the second vehicle. The third shot was different. It wasn't aimed at equipment. It was aimed at the ground, 3 meters in front of the advancing column's lead scout. The round struck the frozen crust and threw up a spray of ice and dirt that the scout walked through, and then stopped, heart hammering, understanding suddenly that the distance between a warning and a consequence was a matter of inches and intent, and that whoever was making these decisions was making them with absolute control. The column stopped. In the ruins to the east, Delta 7 was in position. Webb had deployed his 11 operators across 3 elevated positions, the same positions that Hartwell's pencil marks had identified, positions that offered interlocking fields of fire across every main approach corridor in the western section of the ruins. He had looked at those marks for a long time before deploying and understood, in the bones of his professional experience, that whoever had chosen them knew this terrain the way a person knew the layout of their own childhood home. Every corner, every shadow, every approach. Calloway fired first 2 controlled shots that disabled the heavy weapon on the trailing vehicle, targeting the mount rather than the operator. The sound rolled through the ruins and the Western force went to ground, suddenly very aware that they had walked into a coordinated engagement without knowing it. Decker's element took the northern breach approach, holding the line there with disciplined fire that kept the flanking element pinned in a dead-ground corridor where their numbers and their mounted weapons were equally useless. Gould, from the eastern wall rise, had a clean line across the central courtyard and used it with the restrained precision of a man who had spent 40 years of combined military service, learning exactly how much force a situation required and no more. And through all of it, from above and between and around, the other shots continued faster now, less calibrated, more urgent. The figure in the northeast tower had abandoned the long patience of the previous hours. The light was coming, and with the light came exposure. And with exposure came a calculus that had to be solved in real time. 22 against 12 had been impossible odds. 22 against 12 plus 1, properly coordinated, was something else. At 0617, the Western Forces command element made the decision to withdraw. The decision was made by a man named Harper Colton, a contractor with enough operational experience to recognize the geometry of a losing position, and he made it cleanly and without excessive deliberation. His force had taken 2 vehicle casualties, no personnel casualties. Someone out here was making very specific choices about the difference, and were engaged by a defending force whose exact size and position they could not determine. He ordered withdrawal. They pulled back through the western gate in a controlled retrograde that took 11 minutes. At 0628, the shooting stopped. The ruins were silent again, but it was a different silence, not the predatory quiet of the previous hours, but something exhaled, something released. The snow that had continued falling through the entire engagement lay undisturbed across the flat surfaces of the broken walls, and the first true light of sunrise came through the eastern gap between the ruins and the ridgeline, and painted everything in pale gold and long shadow. Webb stood in the center of the ruins and looked at what was left of the morning. 11 operators, alive and complete, 0 casualties. He turned to Hartwell. She was reloading something, a compact bolt-action platform, suppressed, precision configured, that she was breaking down with the economical speed of long habit. She did not look up from the task. Webb watched her for a moment. "That was you," he said, "the whole time." She finished the breakdown, stowed the components, and stood up. She was covered in snow, not the wet surface snow of someone who had been walking, but the deep, integrated cold of someone who had been lying still in the stuff for hours. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. "I was in a position to help," she said. It was, in some essential way, insufficient as an explanation. Webb knew it and she knew it, but neither of them had the language for the fuller version yet, and the sun was coming up over the ruins, and 11 operators needed to move before the Western force reconsidered, and the fuller version could wait. "The extraction point," he said. 2 clicks east. "Same route in." She paused. "I know a safer line if you trust the time." He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "Lead," he said. They made the extraction point at 0712. The team moved in a tight, quiet column through the frozen pre-dawn, following Hartwell through routes that avoided the open ground and the ridgeline approaches that the Western Forces vehicles had used. She moved without hesitation, reading the terrain with the automatic fluency of someone who had committed every contour to memory long before this morning. The extraction vehicles were a pair of armored personnel carriers sitting on a gravel shelf 2 clicks east of the ruins, their engines idling for warmth, the drivers having heard the shooting and spent the last 90 minutes running through contingency protocols and finding none of them applicable. When the column emerged from the broken ground and walked into the headlight wash, the relief on the drivers' faces was specific and genuine. Webb counted his operators in. All 11, plus Farr, plus Hartwell. He stood by the vehicle and looked back at the ruins one time. The complex was a dark geometry against the pale sky, its broken towers and collapsed walls catching the first horizontal light of sunrise. It looked, at this distance, like it had looked on the aerial reconnaissance photos, ancient, empty, indifferent. He knew it wasn't empty. Inside the vehicle, the operators began the quiet, methodical descent from operational intensity checking equipment, drinking water, saying almost nothing in the particular silence that followed action. Gould sat with his rifle across his knees and stared at the floor. Aguilar had his eyes closed, not sleeping, just processing. Fletcher was running his hands over his kit in the compulsive inventory check that some operators never unlearned. Farr sat next to Hartwell. "You should have told us earlier," he said. "Probably," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the vehicle, the light was fully up now, thin winter gold across the desert, the snow beginning to soften at the edges where the sun hit it. "Because I needed them to trust me before I told them something they wouldn't believe," she said. "People don't believe things that require them to revise who they think they are. I needed to be useful first." Farr nodded slowly. "And the ruins. You know them." It wasn't a question. She looked at the floor of the vehicle for a moment. Then, quietly, "I grew up in them." Webb heard this from the next seat. He turned. "The ruins," she said. "The Tarhun complex. I was 8 years old when the convoy my family was with was hit 20 years ago. They didn't have enough personnel to recover everyone. Some people got left." She paused. "I wasn't military. I wasn't anyone. I was just a kid who didn't die." The vehicle was very still. "The people from the local settlement found me after 3 days," she said. "But by then I had already..." She stopped. Started again. "The ruins are very specific. Once you learn them, you don't unlearn them. I went back to the States eventually. I went through school. I joined the service because it was the only context where what I knew how to do was useful rather than she searched for the word. Rather than pathological. Webb said nothing. Farr said nothing. The logistics node we were briefed on, she said. It's real. But it's also a data collection operation for the Western Force Colton's people. They've been running signals collection through this basin for 18 months, building a targeting database. When I saw the operational briefing 3 weeks ago, I recognized the grid references. I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain. She paused. I'm certain now. You could have told command, Webb said finally. I tried, she said. The briefing officer who received my written assessment was part of the network Colton's people had built. My report went nowhere. I was told I was misreading the intelligence. She looked at him directly. So I made sure I was on this deployment. And I planned for contingencies. Farr was looking at her with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something more genuine. The pencil marks on your map, he said. I made those 2 weeks ago when I got the operational overlay, she said. Those positions are the best defensive geometry in the complex. I've known that since I was 9. The vehicle began to move. The ruins fell behind them in the dusty morning light, retreating into their ancient indifference. Webb looked out the back window for a moment. The other shot, Gould said. Suddenly he had been listening without appearing to. The one that almost took my head off when I was on the wall. Hartwell looked at him. You were silhouetted, she said. I moved you. I'm sorry about the proximity. Gould absorbed this. You were managing us, he said. The whole time. Where we were. Where we moved. I was trying to keep you inside the geometry. Your geometry, he said. Not accusatory. Just precise. Yes, she said. My geometry. The vehicles reached the hardball road at 0741 and turned east toward the forward operating base. The light stretched long across the empty desert. The snow was already beginning to sublimate in the increasing warmth, the white surface turning translucent, the frozen crust underneath beginning to release the water it had borrowed from a sky that had no business being this cold over a desert that had no business having snow. At 0758, Farr took out a notebook paper. Again. He was a man who distrusted electronics and wrote a single line. He showed it to no one and tore out the page and folded it into his breast pocket. At 0803, they arrived at the forward operating base. The vehicles stopped. Doors opened. The operators climbed out into the increasing cold of the desert morning, their breath visible in the air, their eyes carrying the particular flatness that followed action without adequate sleep. Webb was last out. He turned to help Hartwell down from the vehicle, a reflex. Not a comment, and she took his hand for exactly 1 second before stepping down independently. He looked at her. There'll be a debrief, he said. I know. Full debrief. Everything you told me, and everything you didn't. I know, she said again. She turned toward the base. She moved the same way she had moved through the ruins economically. Precisely, reading the environment around her with the automatic attention of someone for whom situational awareness was not a trained skill but a survival adaptation from a time before any of this. Before the service and the briefings and the pencil marks on operational overlays. Before all of it, Webb watched her go. Then he turned back to look east, toward the ruins, a dark line against the morning horizon 2 kilometers away. From here they were just shapes, just broken stone and old shadow. He thought about an 8-year-old girl in there, in the winter, alone, learning to survive in the geometry of ruins that would one day tell an entire team of Special Forces operators exactly where to stand to stay alive. He thought about all the things you learned when there was no one else to do the learning for you. Fletcher appeared beside him. Who is she? Fletcher asked. Webb watched the ruins for another moment. Someone who was here before, he said. He turned and followed his team inside. Behind them, at the edge of the forward operating base perimeter, in a moment that no one saw because no one was looking in the right direction at the right time, the radio mounted on the lead extraction vehicle, which had been fully functional all morning, which had never been targeted, which had sat untouched through the entire engagement, emitted one brief burst of static, then went silent. Then, from a distance that should not have been possible, something struck the antenna housing at a precise, clean angle. The radio went dark. No threat, no transmission, no need. Just a signal, sent to no one in particular, that something patient and precise was still out there in the ruins. Still watching the geometry, still counting the angles, still there.